Hi everyone. So welcome to our final module number 6, where we are going to explore social, cognitive, and behavioral learning theories of personality. So if you give me 1 second, let me share my screen. So again, this is the final module. For many of you, this may be stuff that you already have some familiarity with, depending on your own experience in school or even in some work settings. I know there's a few people who are behavioral health professionals and others who work in the mental health field. And so many of these theories probably have already been ingrained or you've seen them in action. So with that, let's kind of give some context of what these theories are. So we started off with the clinical theories of psychodynamics, which historically began in the late 1800s and really became popular in the United States in the basically post World War II. And around that time too, because of the popularity after post World War II of psychodynamics, humanism and humanistic approaches, i.e., Carl Rogers and existential psychology and positive psychology, started to grow as well. Well, the third wave of what was happening at this time too is the behavioral theories within Western psychology. And so, behavioral theories, the cognitive theories, and the social learning theories are a rejection to humanism, humanistic approaches, as well as psychodynamics. So, to give more specific on the timeline, as psychodynamics was developing in Europe in the early 1900s, behavioral theory in the early 1900s was developing in the United States. And from a philosophical standpoint, what really motivated that was the precursor of pragmatism. Pragmatism with William James and John Dewey in the United States is essentially very kind of logical, realistic, and very problem solving oriented. So, the thing to remember with these theories is we're not interested in understanding what's happening in someone's mind. We're really focusing on the present moment as well as things we can observe. And so, what we're going to see too is this is almost a bookend to where we started this class with trait theories and biological perspectives, because we're going to see that there is an emphasis of how we respond to the environment is based off our nervous system. And so, stimulus happens, and then our nervous system creates a response to that. In addition to, just like trait theories, we're focusing on the present and we're looking to describe what's happening through things we can observe. So that's the opposite of the other two clinical approaches, which focused on the development of the psyche, and then that psychodynamics, and then humanism or humanistic approaches is development of the self. So here we're looking at behaviors, thoughts, and so we want someone to explicitly say their thoughts because we need to have it be objective, and feelings that are in the current moment. And how we get that information is I'm not suggesting or making an assumption or interpreting what your thoughts or feelings are. No, that's going to come from you describing your thoughts and feelings. And with having that data, we can work and promote behavioral changes. So the language is going to be a little different for this module. Essentially, what makes up our personality from this perspective is your behaviors, your thoughts, and feelings is what makes you who you are as a person. So if we change our behaviors, thoughts, and feelings, that's going to change the personality. In addition, who you are now has been essentially through the process of observing others, through what's happened before a response, as well as what happened after a response, makes up how you express your personality. So we'll get more into that in just a moment. So, as I already mentioned, these theories are strongly connected to trait and biological. And instead of looking at the whole person, which is very humanistic, we are only looking at specific parts, traits, and behaviors of the person, similar to the psychodynamic elements, as well as, again, going back to trait and biological perspectives. So, to start off with, many of you are probably familiar with Pavlov's dog. Within the behavioral fields, This is the kind of the starting point of behaviorism, the study of behavior. And behaviorism looks at how we learn. How we learn is impacts how we're going to possibly respond in the future. So with classical conditioning, it is pairing a natural response to an unnatural stimuli. This is where the biological perspective happens. So the famous dog experiments was um, naturally, when a dog is exposed to food, they're going to salivate. The trigger is food. What we can do when that food is being presented to the dog, at the time the food's being presented, we can make some sort of noise, let's say ringing the bell. In the example, they use a tuning fork. But if we ring the bell at the same time the dog is receiving the food, what can happen is when we remove the food and just ring the bell, we're still going to get the salivation response, even if there's no food present. So that's what we call the unnatural stimuli. Um, so over time, the bell will create a natural response. So what that means is we have some sort of biological response to some sort of event, and then we can create new stimuli that impacts that natural response. So, for example, if a tiger is presented to us, that's going to be a natural response that we're going to have our fight or flight motif occurs. So we see a threatening stimuli, and then our body's naturally going to respond, either fight, flight, or freeze. And so then what we can do is we can take that real tiger and then we can condition it, let's say, with other events. And so maybe the time we saw the tiger, we also heard the bell of a ice cream truck. Just throwing this random example out there. And so what can happen is that ice cream truck bell, which has no natural association with fear response, can start to develop a fight or flight or freeze response because it was paired with a natural fear of a tiger. So essentially with classical conditioning, to sum it all, it's we have already stimuli that impacts a physical response. And when that happens, other uh, elements in the environment can get paired with that natural stimuli, that if we remove the natural stimuli, unnatural things can still have that same response. So when we're looking at classical conditioning, what it's about is something happens first and then our body responds. And so from a personality perspective is some sort of event happens and then we respond to it with either a behavior, thought, or feelings, or maybe all three. And so this is going to be how, depending on the stimuli, we may all respond differently to this. And this is what can make our personalities unique and different from others. So classical, stimulus, and then response. Operant conditioning, which was, again, really developed, excuse me, let me just take a sip, really developed in the United States. It's based off J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. So again, classical, stimulus, response. Operant condition is we act first and then we learn through the consequences of our actions. So what comes after the behavior, the thought or feeling, is going to influence future behaviors. So if we tell a joke, think of this example. If I tell a joke and people laugh, I'm most likely going to tell that joke again. If I tell that joke and no one laughs, then I won't tell that joke again. If I tell that joke and I get punished for it, yeah, there's probably going to be a good chance that I've learned the consequences of telling that joke, which means that there's going to possibly be a very strong response that I never tell that joke again because of the consequences. So if we look through this, the laughter is going to be a reinforcer. So consequences that increase future behavior is known as reinforcements. And consequences that decrease future behavior is known as punishments. So again, I have some sort of behavior, some sort of thought, some sort of feeling, and depending how people respond to that, it's going to increase the probability of it being happening again. That would be reinforcing it. Or if it decreases the probability of it happening again, that's going to be punishing it. So, for example, if we look at the feelings perspective, if you were in an environment growing up where talking about feelings had negative consequences to it, you would learn essentially that it would not be it's not appropriate to talk about your feelings. And so again, that would decrease it. Now, let's say you go into a new environment where there's an encouragement of talking about your feelings, and you do, and there's a positive reinforcement of it, you've had a corrective experience with that, which is going to change your behavior going forward. So, consequences can be person specific, meaning we're all going to have various preferences and dislikes. So, what that thing's to remember is, in theory, right? If we want to decrease the behavior, we're going to have some sort of punishment with it. If we want to increase it, we're going to want some sort of reinforcement. But we need to understand the person, because certain things are going to be positive or negative depending on the person we're working with. So, for example, if if we're going to give people chocolate as a reinforcer, but one person does not like chocolate, that is not going to be a good reinforcement for them. So, in addition to that, if we're trying to kind of sanction someone, we have to be careful that if we're putting someone in timeout or yelling at them, that that may actually, in fact, be reinforcing them because they're getting the attention that they're seeking. So we have to be very aware of person's preferences and dislikes when it's coming up with changing the consequences of their behavior. We can also do our own kind of behavioral modification, where if we want to change our behavior, we have to make sure the rewards are worth something that's going to entice us to continue that behavior going forward. So with this too, and this is, I think, where there's a lot of complexity with this, is we're going to use terms such as positive and negative reinforcement. Understand that positive and negative, when we're using in this context, does not mean good or bad. So what this means is, when we're giving some sort of reinforcement or punishment, we have two options. I can either give you something or take away something. So, for example, let's say I'm going to give someone, they did a good job and I want to reinforce that behavior, I will give them money. Let's say they did a good job and I want to reinforce them. So I'm going to give them, or I'm going to take away some responsibility that they have to do. That can still, that taking away is going to be a negative because I'm taking something away. But for them, that may be awesome. Like, whoo, I have less responsibility. I'm going to keep doing good work. So to sum that up, when a consequence is added, we call this positive. It can be positive reinforcement or punishment. So something's added as a response to the behavior. When something is taken away, subtractive, that's negative. We call that negative reinforcement. So it doesn't mean good or bad. It just means, am I adding something or am I taking away something? So adding can be reinforcing, or adding can be punishment. So there's going to be much debate about the nuance of how we label positive and negative reinforcements, because again, depending on the person, they may have different likes and dislikes, as well as the language can get rather complicated. So a common example is timeout. So let's say a child engages in something inappropriate, and we're going to foster a timeout system. So timeout is going to be a consequence. Now, by giving a timeout, that's going to be adding. So that's going to be positive punishment because I'm giving them a timeout. Or is it going to be a negative punishment because I am subtracting them from something? I'm taking them away from the situation they're in. So let's say I'm taking them away from their group. So what I mean by that, the nuance can be rather flushed out regarding, is it really positive or negative? But essentially, to sum it up, I'm either giving something or I'm taking away something, and there may be a gray area in certain reinforcements of how we label it. But to sum it up, Operant conditioning is the consequences that occur after we do something, where classical conditioning is the stimuli that results into how we respond. so we can, the third element of learning theories is social learning. So this is made famous by Albert Bandura. There's a video on Brightspace module for this week about the Bobo doll experiment, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So essentially, what it is, in addition to operant and classical conditioning for learning, we can also learn by observing others, how others are treated, others' consequences before and after punishment. So we can learn quite a bit through observing how others act in certain situations. Now, this is going to be way beyond the scope of this class, but this would be addressed more in social psychology or leadership classes, that certain role models are going to have more influence in how we learn compared to others. So there's a lot of elements that go into play of this, that certain role models will have more influence based on gender, prestige, social class, age, relationship to us, attractiveness levels. There'll be many different components that go into how much we can learn through role models. But so with this, we have to understand that our personality is going to consist of our personal elements of what was been rewarded through operant conditioning, is what has been influenced by classical conditioning, and the environment around us is also going to influence our personality. So on one hand, if we're growing up in a social system, say family, this is why we can have similar personality traits with family members, not only from a genetic level, but also because this is who we observed of how they act and respond in certain situations. In addition to that, we can also see how someone acts and is either rewarded or punished for it, that we can be like, I am not doing that behavior that way, because I can see how that has responded, how people have responded to certain behaviors. So to sum up, and to get less technical, social learning is about how you can learn about yourself, your thoughts, and your feelings by seeing how others interact with their environment and seeing how their behaviors, thoughts, and feelings are reinforced, either positively, negatively, through punishment or reinforcement. So, summary of learning theories. Our behavior is going to comes from what happened before, so the classical conditioning, what came after we behaved a certain way, operant conditioning, along with the social environment, social learning. So our personality is composed of elements of classical conditioning of stimulus and responses, of operant conditioning of what we've learned about the consequences of our personality, along with the social environment, seeing how other people have responded and their personality characteristics as well. So the kind of cliche saying from a social learning standpoint that your personality is the amalgam of the 5 closest people to you has some significance to that. For example, your personality is going to be reinforced by the people around you in some way. They're going to influence your personality in some way, and you're going to learn from them, and that's going to influence your personality. So there is some truth to, we really are the how much friends, families, and people we spend time to can influence our own personality. Therefore, if we need to change certain elements of our personality, we can look at what happens before. So that's the antecedent activating event. That's classical conditioning. What happens after, the consequences, okay, operant conditioning, and the social context, the environment. So those are the elements I can change. I can change to what happens before, so the stimuli. I can change the response, how I respond to the stimuli. And I can also change my social context. Very similar to the Adlerian model we talked about before, of how our lifestyle is reinforced by all these conditions. And if we change one, we're going to change others. And we'll talk more about that from the cognitive standpoint. So this is where the behavioral analysis really comes into play. And again, I know some of you have been trained in this. So to do this behavioral modification, we're going to gather as much objective data as humanly possible. Again, that's the cornerstone of these behavioral models and social learning models, is about being objective. We're not talking about archetypes. We're not talking about the real or ideal self. We're taking measurement and using the scientific method to understand what's happening in the environment and how we can modify this. So we want the data of what happens before, after, and the environment within the behavior occurs. What's reinforcing this behavior? And therefore, having all this data, we can make some sort of an adjustment for this. So again, we're looking for when, where, and what happened before, after, the context of the behavior, as well as we want to look at the exceptions to this. When is the behavior not occurring? Because those exceptions could be a snapshot of the environment that we need to create in order for the behavior to be modified. So, in moving with this, we're now in the age of our cognitive behavioral models, where not only is the external world very important, but how we make sense of the external world through our thoughts is going to be really important as well. So originally, these two elements were not connected. It wasn't until really Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, two prominent psychologists, who really integrated these approaches. Albert Ellis was coming more from a philosophical, kind of Socratic questioning perspective, and Aaron Beck was taking kind of psychodynamics and really trying to reduce the jargon element of this. And so what we do is these elements integrate extremely well with social learning behaviorism. And essentially what occurs from the model we just talked about is in between the stimulus and thoughts and our behaviors. So in between operant and classical conditioning is going to be cognition. So we're going to have a stimulus, and the stimulus creates some sort of thoughts, and then we're going to respond based on those thoughts. Same way from operant conditioning is a behavior happens, and because of the consequences can create some sort of thoughts with this. So responses can include actions, more thoughts, feelings, and emotions. So the stimulus triggers a thought, and that thought can lead to more thoughts, kind of like, you have a thought of a stressful thought, and that stressful thought can now mean you're on a train of more and more stressful thoughts. So it can start off with running a minute late to work. The next thing you know, you're catastrophizing, thinking of all the things that can go wrong, feeling very, very overwhelmed. So quickly, this can cascade kind of out of control. So we want to be aware that the stimulus activates a thought, which can activate more thoughts, more feelings, more emotions, or maybe behaviors, because a lot of times these reflective behaviors are a way to manage those responses. So if something's uncomfortable for us, we may respond in a quick way to remove that stimuli. So for example, I can even change thoughts to feelings. Let's say something really upsets you and you have that very uncomfortable feeling. The behavior could be either you fight, flight, or freeze. So fight means you could do something to aggressively get away of the stimuli. You could run away, the flight from the stimuli, or you could kind of shut down and freeze, hoping that the stimuli is going to pass. So long story short, if we change the thoughts, we can change our behaviors. Again, very Adlerian perspective. So the thing to remember with all of this is cognition is going to be person specific. So we may have various different thoughts to different stimuli. Again, that's what makes our personality unique. And then that's going to lead to different various behaviors. So to kind of demonstrate how, if we want to change our personality, we also have to view how we think about ourselves. And so here's the CBT triangle, cognitive behavioral therapy triangle, that again, if I change one of these components, it's going to change the other. So the common idea, change a thought, change a behavior. So good example of this If you ever seen the movie Finding Nemo, um, Bruce the shark and his two shark companions are constantly using the mantra, fish are not food. So, what they're trying to do is they're trying to overcome not only classical conditioning, where they are meat eaters, right? They're carnivores, and so as they see fish, that's a stimuli to eat it. And in addition, so something occurred too classically, where they've learned that eating the fish was not beneficial. What may be more beneficial is becoming friends with them. So to address these kind of hardwired elements of their personality, they're trying to change their thoughts. And the mantra is fish are not food. And so here we have this element of if we change the thoughts, we change our behaviors, and we change our feelings. So, from a personality perspective, one element we can go for our own personality growth and development is being very aware of our thoughts. And this can be reflecting about our thoughts, expressing our thoughts, and being aware that if we want to change, we can change this through our thoughts. In addition, there's other models of therapy that focus on different components of this. The CBT element is very thought focused, change thoughts, change behaviors. But old school behavioral therapy, exposure based therapy, if I change the behaviors, that's going to change the thoughts and the feelings. And then additionally, we're in another kind of milestone of the growth of the emotion focused therapies. The emotion focused therapies essentially are focusing on the feeling perspective. If I can change the feeling, that's going to change my thoughts and that will change my behaviors. So, no matter what theoretical orientation that people can use, essentially what it is, if I change one of these perspectives, that's going to impact and promote some sort of growth. So, a lot thrown at you, and summary wise, with this, to sum up this theory, this model is focused on really how we learn about ourselves. We learn about ourselves from how already our natural kind of responses in our body, our nervous system responds to stimuli. And with that, when that happens, that means unnatural stimuli can be conditioned to this. Phobias, fears, attractions, all kind of can play into that component. With that too, our personality is made up of constant elements in our past, where depending how we respond to a certain circumstance, there was either reinforcement or there was punishment. And so that's how our personality kind of molded as it went along. We also had our personality grow and develop through seeing how others react to us. And again, finally, the other element of our personality is how we think about ourselves. And so here is really the thing to remember from all of these perspectives is if our personality is becoming consistent, we may be in an environment that is consistently reinforcing who we are now. If our personality is changing, we're in an environment where reinforcements are creating new behaviors. So, again, if someone wants their personality to change, we have to look at what's maintaining it. Is it the thoughts? Is it the social environment? Is it the classical responses? Is it the unconditional responses? So we have to look at that. And then by wanting to foster change and growth, we can go from many different perspectives after we have a good understanding of the situation. All right, so we'll end there. Again, this is the last module for this class. Thank you all, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.